Now we know about API routes, including dynamic API routes. Now it is worth a note that there are some alternatives to how we name and structure our files inside of the API folder. And those alternatives are equivalent to the different approaches we can use for regular pages. For example, you can also have catch-all dynamic API routes by adding 3 dots in front of any placeholder name of your choice. This will then not just handle requests to /API/some value, but also to more segments you might have. Equivalent to what you learned about regular pages and catch-all pages. Now we don't need a catch-all dynamic API route here, but it is worth knowing about it. It's also important to understand how Next.js prioritizes these different files. If we send a request to /API/feedback, it's the code in the feedback.js file that will be executed. Now that is not necessarily obvious because we have this dynamic API route. So it could also be possible that requests to /API/feedback are consumed by this file because feedback is simply treated as a concrete value for this feedback ID placeholder. But Next.js is smart, just as it is for regular pages, and if there is a more specific page for a given path value, so since we have a feedback.js file in this case, it will use that more specific file, which makes more sense for this kind of path than the more generic dynamic file. /API some value, on the other hand, would trigger the code in the dynamic API route. So that's just worth knowing. It automatically works correctly here, but it is important to be aware of the fact that Next.js will do this prioritization for you. Now, another important thing to know is that you have some flexibility regarding how you structure your files. You can add a feedback.js file in the API folder to support requests to /API/feedback. Alternatively, just as with regular pages, you could also add a feedback subfolder in the API folder and then move the file in there and rename it to index.js. And here VS Code is asking me whether it should automatically update all imports that pointed at this file. And I will say yes. If you don't get that prompt or you chose no, you should manually update those import paths. So that is the alternative. A file named index.js in the feedback folder in the API folder is the equivalent to having a feedback.js file inside of the API folder, just as it works for regular pages. We can also move our feedback ID.js file in there. But if we do that, that of course also changes the way our API works. Previously, since feedback ID, this dynamic API route, was directly in the API folder, previously /API some value triggered the code in this feedback ID file. Now, since we're in the feedback subfolder, it's actually /API/feedback/some value that triggers the code in here. Now, that is actually a path that makes more sense to me. It's more descriptive. It's clearer that some request sent to /API/feedback/some value should fetch more details for a single feedback than if we have just /API/f1. That doesn't tell us that it's about fetching feedback data if we just look at this kind of path. And hence I will keep this structure of having the square bracket feedback ID file inside of the feedback folder, inside of the API folder. However, that means that in the index.js file in the feedback folder in the regular pages, so in the feedback page component, we also need to update this URL and send our request to /API/feedback/some ID, because I changed that structure in the APIs folder. And now it looks like I broke some imports as well. Yes, here we should import from the index file. And now that works again. So if I now reload, that all works, that works, looking good. So that is how you can also structure your files and folders in the API folder in the Pages folder. It essentially works just as it does for regular pages.